This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Great. Can I welcome everybody back after the breakout sessions? We've overrun just a little bit, so I'm going to keep my eye on my watch in front of me, but I'm sure we'll still have plenty of time to discuss. So I'll just ask the summarisers then to bring back some of the ideas that came out of this morning's sessions, starting off with Lisa and the mic.
Okay, yeah, this has ended up slightly more formal than I expected. So we had a really interesting discussion, which was led by Eva Hauserová, about a very interesting text by Eva Hauserová, Czech writer and journalist and feminist, and a sort of a complex person who wrote a very short text that sort of hovers between a piece of non-fiction, a piece of autobiography, a kind of journalistic piece that's also sort of rather interesting in a literary sense. And our discussion started with Eva very helpfully introducing us or reminding us of the context, the Czech context. This piece of writing is about coming into motherhood in the 1970s, but written in the 1990s in the Czech Republic, and helped us really to understand something about the periodization, I suppose, of socialism, going from the Prague Spring in the 60s through a period of repression, and in the 1970s, at the same time, I guess, as feminism is kind of burgeoning elsewhere, and then going through a sort of time-lagged, delayed interaction with feminism in the 1990s. So that really helped us to get a sense of what the context was for this piece of writing. We talked then about what comes up in the piece, which is about what does it actually then mean to have been a worker who becomes a mother in that context. And the author talks about moving from being a kind of scientific worker, someone who's trained to be in the workplace under socialism in a very particular kind of way, and how motherhood is sort of conceptualized as a kind of version of freedom in a way, or a place where some freedoms might be able to exist, where something real and valuable can develop. And we talked a bit about that idea of finding private solutions to, if you like, deformed public life, and the real contradictions and reversals of how we might imagine what private freedoms and public lives are about in that particular kind of context. So the kind of cult of motherhood that's referred to in the text has to be understood in the context of educated women who at the same time couldn't travel, couldn't necessarily study what they wanted to study, couldn't follow their own interests freely, and where getting married and having a family ironically becomes a place where you have some although still manipulated, still controlled, but some sense of a kind of isle of freedom. So it's a very interesting set of relationships between family and work that emerged. One of the literary tropes we looked at in the text is the use of this kind of self-interview that runs through the text. So there's sections of description, and then there are questions that the author poses to herself. And we had a very interesting discussion about whether there might be a relation between this literary trope and those practices, can we call them that, of autocritique that were promoted under sort of Stalinist regimes in the 1950s, and whether some of that internalization of autocritique might be coming through, or was this an ironic version of autocritique. So we had to think about that, about how literary form and political contexts are intertwined. And then we looked also at a bit of a few ideas about genre, of the different genres of mother writing, because in some ways this text looks very familiar actually, and very reminiscent of lots of 1970s and 80s sort of mother writing texts about the shock of coming into motherhood for the first time, having been in a certain kind of relatively well-educated, relatively middle-class sort of environment, and then having to cope with that shock and the adjustment, also a form of downward mobility that can often happen around housing and around access to resources, and also this obsession with mess, the sense of being completely out of control in motherhood, and then having to deal with endless descriptions in much of that literature around the physical, material matter of motherhood. So in some ways this text looked familiar in that sense. We had a very interesting discussion about whether Eva Hauserová could have been, what kind of access did she have to those feminist texts, and that gave rise to a discussion then about time lags around translation. What happens when texts aren't translated immediately, or women stumble across texts or get access to texts 20 or 30 years after they've been written. And we had a very interesting discussion about temporality in relation to feminism and motherhood, where we ended up discussing some issues about how there's often actually a time lag in the history of feminism around what does and doesn't get passed on from one generation to the next of feminists, and also how there's this kind of strange, resistant break of narrative or continuity often in motherhood as well, so that each generation seems to stumble into motherhood as if for the first time. That thing we talk about quite a lot in motherhood studies seems somehow also related to a similar kind of temporality in feminism itself, or in feminist histories, and was very relevant then for thinking about how one might have to put together a picture as a 1990s feminist in a post-socialist environment out of texts that are, some of which are available, others aren't. You might pick up a text that is very relevant to your current situation that was written in the 70s, but also conjoin it with a bit of theory that's very, very contemporary and also is relevant, and that somehow you're making a kind of hybrid field to draw on for understanding your maternal experience. And so this text seemed to show something of that kind of hybridity and the broken upness of narrative that I think we were relating to histories of feminist thought and histories of how motherhood does and doesn't get passed on, if you like. Does anyone from the group want to?
I think that basically, that was it. And as you have reproduced that, so it's amazingly rich. Well, I just feel that the discussion was amazingly rich, and you reproduced it.
It was a canter. We did a canter through our rather longer, more meandering discussion.
Okay, so that's good. Thanks.